think we're ready. I think we're ready to start. Well, welcome everyone here in our classroom, and for those of you who may be following us on our YouTube channel. My name is Luca Somigli. I am the chair of the newly minted Department of Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, Latin American Studies, as well as the current holder of the Emilio Goggio Chair in Italian Studies. And my role today is present one to introduce you to our Distinguished Goggio Visiting Professor, John Foote. John is a professor of modern Italian history, University of Bristol. He is one of the foremost scholars of modern Italian history, having published extensively on various aspects of Italian culture, sports, including two histories of the histories of the two sort of great sports in the Italian, not just Italian imagination, soccer or football or calcio, just so that we're not confused, and cycling. He has also worked on fascism and other of Italian politics, and in fact, his lecture to today is based on his latest publication in the area of Italian history and politics, the book The Red Brigades, the Terrorists Who Brought Italy to Its Knees, that just came out from the publisher Bloomsbury in 2025. The title of his talk is The Red Brigade 70 to 1988, Writing a History of a Terrorist Group. So please join me in welcoming John to our university and to our Goggio series.
Thank you very much, Luca. Thank you to everyone for coming today. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm very honoured to be invited to Toronto, and I've been here a week and I love the city already, so I'm really enjoying. I'm going to talk today. I thought I'd get the frivolous stuff out of the way before the important stuff of football next week. I'm going to talk around my book, which has just come out, around some of the themes relating to this book. As Lucas said, came out in June, is coming out now in a slightly modified version. Things are happening, although all this stuff took place a long time ago, it's live and relevant in some ways. Yesterday, one of them, a leading brigatista, died, and it's all over the newspapers. Anna Laura Braghetti, who was one of the people most involved in the Moro kidnapping in 1978, also was the inspiration behind the film Buongiorno Notte, and so, you know, it's front page news, and there's still a trial going on over some aspects of this story in Algeria, with 80-year-old people in the dock. So this is not kind of dead history, still live history. There's still lots of material to be consulted. What I'm going to talk about today is I'm going to talk about some of the features of my study, what I wanted to find out, but I'll also take you a little bit behind the curtain of the material I was looking at and some of the sort of the ways of studying something like this, which is vast. It was a hoop, but it's created a vast amount of archives, a vast amount of published material, a vast amount of fiction, cinema, photography, all kinds of things, some of which I'll talk about today. And I'm still working on this. I'm thinking of doing a book only about the trial, which I'll talk about later, and there are other aspects of it I keep going down rabbit holes and not really re-emerging in some areas. So I suppose one of the first kind of really basic questions that I wanted to answer was, who were they? Who were these people? Where did they come from? How did they become the Red Brigades? And that's the kind of first part of it. And, you know, this group emerges in the great kind of upheaval and disruption and radicalization of the late 1960s in Italy, particularly 1968, 1969. And the particularity of Italy's 68 was that you had the student movement, which was vast, which really begins actually much earlier than 68 in Italy. In cases 65, 66, you can see elements of it emerging. And then you've got the enormous workers' uprising and strikes of the hot autumn of 1969. And these two moments, which continue right through the 70s, which is often called il maggio strisciante, the long May. You know, May 68 in Paris is the kind of classic 68. Italy's 68 is kind of right across the 70s. That moment radicalizes, and that's a very a word that we use a lot, people very quickly. And they become, I've found lots of evidence, they go from fairly moderate positions, soft left positions, you might say, or even that, just from no politics to extremely radical positions in a very, very quick period of time. The Red Brigades, which was one of many groups on the right and the left, someone's counted like 450 groups, armed groups, that's just armed groups, okay, and that's not even other kinds of groups, formed on the left. Some of them were lasted 2 months, some of them lasted 10 years. It was important, most famous, most effective group on the left, and you've also lots of groups on the right as well. The Red Brigades emerged from really 3 places, although there are other people who come from different places. The first place is the student movement, Trento, which is the most unlikely place to have a student movement, a very sleepy mountain town where they put a university precisely because it was so sleepy, and they started teaching sociology there in the 1960s, first place in Italy to have sociology being taught. And lots of people, young people, were attracted to Trento because of that possibility of studying sociology. And in Trento, you've got a group of important militants who start to move towards positions on the extreme left, the far left, in the 1960s, particularly the leadership of the group, Renato Curcio, Maracagol, there are others. It's not just those two. So there are the students, and Trento is a place of constant demonstrations, of student movements, of student documents, occupations. And so some people emerge from that with that kind of background. And at a certain point they say, we can't go any further with the students. Let's go to where the workers are. And they all go to Milan in 68, 69. And there they come across a number of people from another place, Media, which is another kind of part of that early group. And these people are young people who, whose parents were almost always, and grandparents were almost always communists, Communist Party members, and they were Communist Party members. And they've been radicalized away from the Communist Party in Reggio Emilia. And in Reggio Emilia, there's a place called L'Appartamento, which is a flat rented by some of these figures, where they discuss politics, talk about Vietnam, talk about Che Guevara, talk about what's going on in the world. And they also have contact with ex-partisans in that space. And a number of the core group of the Red Brigades, which will remain an important part of them, come from Reggio Emilia, so directly out of the Communist Party, contrast and actually expelled in many cases from the Communist Party. And they also go to Milan. So in these different kinds of people come together, and they come together around the factory strikes, particularly in the Pirelli factory, which is on the edge of Milan in 1969, 1970. And around the Pirelli factory, there's a group, a kind of organization formed, which is not part of the trade unions, which is called a Comitato Unitario di Base, which is a kind of Soviet. Has workers from the factory, has people from the movement, and they meet and they talk about politics. And all of the first Red Brigades people, and they're not yet called the Red Brigades, they all meet in this place and they talk politics and they strikes and they see the mass movement and they get involved with the Pirelli workers. So at the first kind of radicalization, it's through the students and through student politics and international politics, but the meeting place began during the hot autumn in 1969. And this tiny group of students, maybe 6, 7 people, they get together and they say, and they decide that they want to take things further, take up arms. they've read about all this thing. I'll talk about how people learn to be an armed group. And they call themselves, they get a name, they get a symbol, and they form themselves into a group. In 1970, that's the beginning of the Red Brigades. And they call themselves Brigate Rosse, which is in part from international inspiration. It's part from the resistance, which I'll talk about. And that's the formation. They don't really know what to do at that point. They don't have a plan. They don't have a strategy. They are magpies. They read books published by Feltrinelli. They read the newspapers. Lots of it comes from cinema. And they're kind of learning. And one of the things I was interested in is, how do people learn to be terrorists? How do they learn to take up the armed struggle? What's their kind of, what are they reading? What are they doing? Because they're not trained at all. None of them have done military service. In fact, people often go into the Red Brigades to avoid military service. Exactly that point of being called up is when they go into hiding, because they don't want to do military service. None of them have any armed training, any political training, talking or on the streets. And so that's another thing that interests me in talking about them. And one of the things that they tap into, which I'm interested in, which is talked about in the book, is the idea of the gun, the fascination of weapons and the armed struggle. And this is a global fascination. Vietnam, Cuba, Uruguay, Tupamaros, all these different groups, and they're reading it in magazines and books and looking at it in films. One of the magazines I've studied as a kind of inspiration for this gun culture was a magazine published by Feltrinelli, Editore, but actually edited by Giangiacomo, which was called Tricontinentale, which was a Cuban-produced magazine, but it had an Italian version, which was partly just translating the Cuban texts, but also had its all kind of Italian input. And it would have at the back of every issue, and it's an extraordinary thing to actually kind of read. It was in edicola, right? It would have a guide to how you use the gun, or how you create a bomb, or how you can shoot down a helicopter. This is one example of it. It's talking about the use of a particular kind of gun. It's very useful at close quarters. It can cause a lot of damage. You can cut it to modify it. It's a sort of guide to, fixing your fridge or something, but it's a gun. And in fact, you might say this is kind of romanticism, this doesn't matter, this hasn't got any connection, but actually, often the gun they are using is expressly that gun. That type of gun turns up in all kinds of Red Brigades bases. So there's a gun culture, a culture of romanticism around guns, about guerrilla struggle, about the use of guns, that it's a good thing, it's good and it's the only way forward. And this isn't just the core group of brigades. I'll talk a bit later about the hinterland. I'm very interested in the hinterland because on their own they wouldn't have survived 5 minutes. The hinterlands them to survive. So we have this kind of gun culture and revolutionary culture quite widespread on the left at this time, and very powerful. And there are lots of guns around in Italy at this time. It's quite easy to get hold of guns. There are numerous shops you can get them from. You can just go and buy them legally, but also there's traffic in arms, which is something which is very common at that time. So the inspiration varied, and it's, as I said, they're magpies. They pick and choose the bits they like. They don't actually study the history very seriously. They pick the bits they think are good, and they ignore the bits they think don't work, or they just don't even see them. And this is kind of a galaxy of the kind of all the things they're reading about in magazines, in books, watching in cinema and documentaries at this time. And it's a whole eclectic mix of armed struggles that are going on. And if you read the left-wing magazines at the time, and there's hundreds of them, they're very much telling you stories about these places. And some of these groups become household names. Some of the members of these groups are in Italy. Rome is a kind of crossroads of cultures and military, particularly Palestinians, but also other groups, people in exile at that time. Very important, often overlooked, is a group called the Ros in Uruguay, which is a direct inspiration for the Red Brigades, who became very famous in the late 1960s, early 1970s, for kidnapping high-level diplomats. They kidnapped a British diplomat, for example. For 10 months, they kidnapped American operatives. And this was world news. What the Red Brigades don't like about that story is that it ended terribly in repression, military dictatorship. But they don't bother about that. They take the bits they want, and they're not systematic. They pick and choose which bits they like, and are inspired by all kinds of texts. And texts are being published by Feltrinelli, by Arnaudi, by mainstream publishers. These are not underground texts. There's a mass market for these books at that time. And of course, we have Italian factors involved as well, which are very, very important. The resistance, which I'll talk about in a minute, or the idea of the betrayed resistance, which is extremely powerful. And we have a direct line to that. Many of the Reggio Emilia group, for example, their parents, their grandparents were in the resistance. The partisans are still around. They've still got their guns in some cases. Okay? So they're not much older than they were in 1945. This is only 1965. They're only 40. They're not 80. So and some of them are kind of interested in connecting. Some of the first brigades are actually ex-partisans as well. So that idea is very powerful. But then, of course, we got Piazza Fontana and the bomb of Piazza Fontana in December 1969. The idea that the state or some sort of conspiracy has taken place, that there's going to be a coup any minute, and that the resistance needs to be reborn. We are the new partisans. That also feeds in. So a mixture of international influences without any kind of systematic coherence, and Italian factors as well. Particularly important is this book, Senza Tregua. Giovanni Pesce was a partisan in Milan, and Turin in the Gap, in the Gruppi Armati Patriottici. He worked as a kind of urban fighter. He worked in the cities and he assassinated people. Well-known figure. And this book is republished by Feltrinelli in 1967 in a different version, much more jazzed up version, with an introduction directly by Feltrinelli, trying to connect it to what's going on in the 60s with a new cover. And this it's an amazing text. It's a very readable text, and it really inspires people. And it makes explicitly, and I think Pesce is a little bit exploited here because he isn't on that at all. He's very much coherent Communist Party guy, quite mainstream, but the book is not read that way by many people with the eyes of 1968. For example, about a third of the way in, there's about 3 pages, basically how do you build a bomb, a bomb yourself. How can you build a bomb? A guide. And he says, do this, put some salt in it, get some condom, put the acid in. And the Red Brigades did that. They did it exactly, almost basically followed it word for word. So it's a manual. It's read in a very different way in the spirit of the times. And the idea that resistance had not achieved its ends, that's very powerful as well. The idea of being betrayed, the idea that the values of the resistance not being achieved is important to their worldview. Some of the groups are actually called Senza Tregua as well. It's a very quotable book in terms of you can pick and choose which bits of it you want, discard the bits that you don't. So how they learn terrorists is through reading, which is quite weird if you think about it. They read fiction, they read books about the terrorists, of which there are dozens of them coming out. They read newspapers. Quite a lot of it is from cinema, particularly the very obvious inspiration is the Battle of Algiers, which they all seen 30 times and read into it what they want. Again, they read into it what they want, but they're all inspired by that. That's earlier, but it feeds into 68. But also the films of Costa Gavras, particularly a film that in Italian is called L'Americae, but in English it's called State of Siege, which is about the two Poros kidnapping it's based on the kidnapping of an American official who's later executed by the two Pomaros, played by, now I can't remember who was played by the very famous French actor in State of Siege. Alberto, I'm looking at you. You should know. You know, it's the most famous French actor, but he'll come back to it. Anyway, they basically use that as a manual as well. And leading Red Brigades members say, I saw that in the film, so I did it in real life. Okay, so there's that cinema. There's the spaghetti westerns, which they see as inspirations. They love the Wild Bunch. So they're picking and choosing from cinema, from books, from fiction, and then from their own experiences on the streets. Okay, so we also find in this period very, very violent demonstrations, people being killed on the streets, both policemen, demonstrators, right-wingers, left-wingers, and they're also having, many of these, the Red Brigades have had experience actually in the streets, and some of them have served in called the Servizi d'Ordine, which are groups that were formed to manage demonstrations and slowly get more and more armed as time goes on. They start off with sticks, end up in the 70s with guns. Some of the, especially the kind of manovolanza, the workers of the Red Brigades, not the intellectuals, they come directly from the Servizi d'Ordine. They've had experience with violence, analysed by that experience on the streets. So that's how they learn, and partly they learn through what's the manuals that are available. And there are manuals out there, and I should definitely tell you not to download manuals from, so you can still read these books. But they come out with mainstream publishers. This is Pelican, which is a mainstream British publisher, publishes this book. It's called For the Liberation of Brazil, but it contains the entire manual. It tells you which guns to use, how to build bombs, how to organise your group. You know, it's basically a guide to being an armed fighter. Now, Marighella, the writer of it, is working under a dictatorship. So you can just armed struggle, or people did justify it as acceptable within the bounds of a dictatorship. Italy was not a dictatorship in post-war. Post-war Italy is not a dictatorship. Brigades and many people on the left call it a dictatorship. They call it still fascist. They use words like that to describe it. And therefore, they justify their own violence, often through this kind of description of the state. So this book circulates, it's published in English, it circulates in kind of samizdat versions, and it's one of the key manuals. There are others as well, but it's the key manual they follow that. Because if you're going to survive a terrorist group, you need to follow rules. The groups that don't follow these rules, they last 10 minutes or 2 months. One of the reasons the Red Brigade survived for 18 years, which is a very long for a group in an advanced industrial society, which is not inspired by nationalism, like the Basques or Northern Ireland, which lasted longer, but they've got a kind of nationalist thing. Why they so long is they had very strict rules on compartmentalization. They divide themselves into cells. Nobody knew each other's name. They had battle names, although that didn't always work. They grew a series of very strict rules, and it's one of the reasons they survived for 18 years. Now, if I was a conspiracy theorist, which I'll come back to later, I would argue that they survived. I would argue, if I was a conspiracy theorist, they survived because the state allowed them. And we can come back to the conspiracy theories, of which there are many, a bit later on. But one of the reasons is the rules they drew up, and they're very good at that. So they have a cell in Genoa, a cell in Milan, a cell in Turin. They don't know what the others are doing. In fact, when Moro is kidnapped, only 3 or 4 people know where Moro is. And that's one of the reasons, again, if I was a conspiracy theorist, I'd say something else. One of the reasons that Moro is not found in the 55 days in Rome after his kidnapping. So what do? How do they act? They formed a group. They're not working, okay, money. So that's an important part of what they need to do. What do they actually do? How do they act as a group? And this is kind of invented. It's all invented. No one's done this before in Italy. One of the things they have to do, armed robberies. So they start, the first kind of things they do is they rob a lot of banks, particularly in central Italy. They go in, it's quite sort of, there's a kind of farcical, comical aspect to this. Not if you're having a gun point, but they kind of go in and say, we don't want your money for private, they tell people they're robbing that they want their money for the people. okay? They're not like the other robbers, even though they're exactly the same as the other robbers. So they go in and actually say that to the bank staff, and they do a whole series of robberies all over Italy quite successfully. It's quite easy to rob a bank in the 1970s. There's not much security. You can just walk in and basically rob. So they do that. They collect all the money, they buy houses, they buy flats, they buy guns. So they're building up a kind of infrastructure. And their first targets emerged directly from the experience of Pirelli and Milan in 1969. Their first targets are factory-based managers. And the managers were really hated. They were called capi operai. And they were really the most hated kind of middle ranking. They were between the bosses and the workers, and they handed out discipline. They would tell people they couldn't go to the toilet. There was all these kind of things. They were the kind of enforcers. And so the capi are the first targets. But they don't attack people at first. They attack their cars. So the first attacks are burning cars of factory managers. And then they the Red Brigades always issued a declaration saying, we have done this. We will act again. We are the Red Brigade. So they brand that they start to spread. And so that they start. And it's very amateurish at first. They don't really know what they're doing. Often the bomb doesn't go off. They only slightly burn a garage. No one really notices. No one's really taking it seriously at this point. So even the police aren't really, they've got lots of other things to do. They're not that bothered about the Red Brigades. Many people on the left don't believe that they're left. Many people say the Red Brigades are actually a provocation. They're actually fascists. They're secret services, all this kind of thing. This goes on for ages. That's why. So at the beginning, it's property, not people, low level. It's invented. They don't really know what they're doing. They get better. One of the things about the history is they get very, very good at being terrorists by the end. And the more they get good at being terrorists, the less they have contact with the masses. That's one of the great contradictions of this kind of group. At first, they're quite connected with the workers and the struggles. As they go on, they're less and less connected. They don't have any contact with actual people apart from themselves by the end, but they're really good at being terrorists by the end. I mean, they're really quite high-level professional. So there's that extraordinary contradiction. And this is quite scary. I don't want to undermine these. Very scary for the factory managers. And they're threatened directly in the factory. They have lists of names, and they say, number one is this person, number two is this person, number three. Top of the list. You don't want to be top of the list, okay? Some people have their jobs. People go into hiding. People don't know if they're going to be attacked. So it's already, there's this climate of fear, which is quite popular amongst parts of the working class. And if I was to anticipate what I'm going to say a bit later, I think what we have in militant working class, Milan, Turin, Genoa, is not necessarily support for the Red Brigades, although you occasionally see that. What you have is non-denunciation. Okay, a lot of people know, but they won't go to the police. Okay, they won't go and denounce them, and sometimes they're very happy about the acts they've done, but they won't openly support them. Okay, so that's a very useful kind of sea to swim in, because you know that you're kind of not going to be betrayed. You're not going to be, if you don't make mistakes, you can survive, but it's not open support, very rarely, and very few of them actually join the organisation. Numbers, but that doesn't matter because they like being tiny. The bigger you are, the more dangerous, more chances you're going to be arrested. Okay, a terrorist group needs to be small to survive. One part of the story is clear, and it's kind of becomes more and more horrific as you dry on, is escalation. So they feel in their own mentality, which becomes more and more closed, that they have to escalate all the time. They have to go further. That they've attacked property. That's not enough. Let's attack people now. There's a series of red lines that they cross, and these are very important moments because it hardens them to the next escalation. So the first escalation, which is very famous, is March 1972. In the centre of Milan, well, northern inner Milan. This guy here, Hidalgo Macchiarini, is a factory manager at a factory called Siemens, where one of the most famous brigatisti, Mario Moretti, works. And there's a cell of Red Brigades at Siemens. It's a big factory. They take him off the street, bundle him into a van, hit him a few times, and drive around for about 2 hours, and then they release him. First attack on a person. It's the first kidnap. They're kind of inspired by Tupamaros here. They're basically copying the Tupamaros, or what they think the Tupamaros did. The most important thing about this is the photo. It makes this a very, very effective piece of action. Because they take this photo. It's not a Polaroid. I'll come back to that in a second. It's a photo with this sort of banner in front, the gun sticking, scared, 2 guns. We don't know who they are. They're kind of mysterious feature of it. The cut, and we've got these kind of combination of slogans. The branding, which is very powerful for the Red Brigades. They've got the best name, often these very long-winded names, like Proletarian Workers for Communism in Italy. Or this is good, you know, Brigate Rosse, really, it's a good name. And they've got a mixture of Maoist slogans and Tupamaros, and they've kind of mixed them all together. And you'll see these come back again and again. Niente resterà impunito, this very straightforward language. One of the other things about Red Brigades, they get more and more verbose, more powerful they get. Their documents get longer and longer, more and more incomprehensible, more and more sort of Marxist-Leninist language. And I'll take you behind this curtain a second for this photo, because this photo is interesting. It's republished lots of times, but it causes chaos with the organization because they make a number of mistakes. The first one is not to use Polaroid, but to use a photo. So they take a number of photos, and in some photos, you can see the face of one of these guys, okay? And then they don't throw the photos away. So when they, in 1972, the police find one of the hideouts, Corvi, they find these photos, they recognize the guy in the photo, they go to him and say, "That's you," and he says, "Well, yeah, it is me." And he's arrested, and he's a 44-year-old ex-partisan from Catania, from a place called, from Lodi, just outside Milan. And he's really pissed off because he expected the photos would be thrown away. He feels betrayed. He gets a 4-year sentence taking part in this. He's in trials for years. He spends a year in prison before the trial, right? So they've messed it up. They've messed up the operation. The photo is very effective, but they've messed up the kind of cleaning up afterwards. After that, they always use Polaroids. They always make sure they throw them away. They send them to the press, and they throw them away. So there's a kind of judicial, and I've seen those photos in the archive, and they've never been published. Very frustrating because they wouldn't let me take them, which was really annoying. So this is kind of the announcement of the Red Brigades onto the world stage, particularly on the Italian stage. The photo is very powerful. People like the photo. A lot of people are very impressed by this, particularly the working class, all of them. And they, it gives a name, it gives them a reputation. They start getting other recruits. People want to join them. And it's quite hard to join them. They don't like just anybody join. It takes a long process, and kind of young people in particular start saying, "I want to join. How do I join? How do I get in touch? How do I help you?" They start to recruit beyond their core group in 1972. Further escalation, 74. And all of these actions, the more sophisticated they get, the longer the preparation. So this action here took 9 months to prepare. And this was a change. So the escalation, they're going from cars to factory managers. 1974, they're going for a magistrate. So the famous phrase, the heart of the state, cuore dello Stato, and this begins. They're going for someone who's very well known. Mario Sossi was a right-wing judge, magistrate, investigating magistrate in Genoa. He'd taken part in high-profile cases. He was hated, not just by the moderate opinion, didn't like him either. He'd arrested Dario Fo, and all kinds of things that had made him very unpopular amongst certain people. So they decided to kidnap him, which is a clever political move. Not only do they kidnap him, they keep him for over 30 days, and they're not caught. And this is when you start negotiating with the state. This is prefiguring what will happen with Moro. This is the kind of keeping the Italian public completely transfixed. The Red Brigades kind of seem on a level with the state. They seem to be able to negotiate, even they completely invented themselves. They invent the idea of people's justice. We're an alternative justice system to you, which is of course completely mad, but people like, it's popular amongst certain parts of the left at that time. Sossi, and the other part of this action, which is very, very popular, is that Sossi is released alive after 35 days. And the promise is that a number of prisoners that the Red Brigades have asked for will all be released. But that promise is not fulfilled. And this makes the Red Brigades very angry. And they will eventually, their first planned murder will be of the magistrate who denied that prisoner exchange. 1976, further escalation of the story. So the story moves on through set piece moments. This will become the main signature of the Red Brigades after 1974. The long kidnap, the negotiation, photo, the family. It's a kind of soap opera that plays out most famously with Moro, but also with numerous others. This is and they'll become very good at this kidnapping thing. I mean, only on one occasion is a kidnap sprung by the police, and that's in 1981. The police do find the Red Brigades when they kidnap someone for money, because they also kidnap for money. And if anyone knows about Italian history, there's lots of kidnapping going on. Hundreds of kidnaps in northern Italy of rich people's kids. So they did 2 kidnaps, the Red Brigades, for money, and then one of them worked. They got lots of money. That was Piero Costa, who was the son of a ship billionaire, and the other goes badly wrong, which is somebody from a wine empire. But I won't go into that story. But they have political kidnaps for money. This will become the main way that the Red Brigade story is played out from 74 on. They will also kill lots of people, but the kidnap is what gets, and the media feasts off this. The media love this, and it's daily news. You read the newspapers at the time. I mean, the amount of space taken up by the Red Brigades is extraordinary in the mainstream press. I mean, also speculation. Where is Sossi? Sossi's wife, Sossi's kids, Sossi's colleagues. All of this stuff. Just a little detour, if I may. When you do kind of work, you go down a lot of rabbit holes, and sometimes you never come out of them. This is the one that I've gone deepest down. This guy, a lot of the Red Brigade story is like you couldn't make up. It's like so crazy and wacky. Frate Mitra, Silvano Girotto, I don't know what people about him. This is somebody who could only really have emerged in the 1970s. He was a small-time criminal in Turin, son of a carabinieri. He's in prison in Le Nuovo for robbery, and then he finds God. Becomes a priest, is all over the newspapers as this good, amazing story of redemption. Becomes a very radical priest, however, preaching class struggle on the shores of Lake Lago d'Orta in northern Italy. Forms a Martin Luther King Center in the place called Ormegna in northern Italy. Then he goes off to Bolivia, ends up in the freedom struggle. So we have, unfortunately, it's not the photo, behind the arm, massive cross and the gun. I mean, it's like you couldn't, everyone in the Red Brigades absolutely loves this stuff, right? So he then comes back and is recruited by the Carabinieri to infiltrate the Red Brigades, which he does successfully, and he manages to get some of their leaders arrested. So this is a story that, if you wrote it in a novel, people would think it was ridiculous, but it actually happened in real life, and the mysteries connected to it. So I've gone down a massive rabbit hole on him. I think I'm maybe going to write a whole book about Frate Mitra, but that's just giving you a detour about what kind of stuff happens when you're writing a book about this. Okay. For the second part or last third of the paper, I want to talk about something I've done the most work on in this book, and it's the biggest clash between the state and the Red Brigades, and it's a moment when it seems like the Red Brigades are winning, which is the trial the Maxi Processo in Turin, which lasts for 2 years between 1976 and 1978. One of the reasons I've done so much on this is I've managed an archive of the trial. I think I'm the first person to get in there. The material is incredible. It's huge. And so it's really given me an insight into it, which is not available in other places. By 1996, quite a lot of the Red Brigades have been arrested. There are still quite a lot outside. And the Italian state decides to have a maxi trial. So it's not each individual being tried for the crimes that they committed, but a trial of a group. Okay, like they're going to try them as the Red Brigades. They think the Italian state thinks it's going to last a couple of months. We've got quite a lot of evidence. We've got informers. And then that will be that, and that will be the end of the case. And they completely underestimate what's going to happen in this trial. This is the first day of the trial in Turin. It's worth noting, no cages, no bars yet. That will come. These are the leaders of the Red Brigades: Gallinari, Curcio, Ferrari, Franceschini is there. There's Franceschini. So the most famous names are all behind bars in 1976. A lot of things happen in this trial. One is the Red Brigades run rings around the state. The state is completely helpless. It seems helpless in this. And one of the second things is these people become celebrities. They're seen in public before. No one knows who they are, what they look like. Their names have circulated, but they don't become people until the trial takes place. And there are 50 photographers there. There are journalists. So they run rings around the state, and how do they do that? Firstly, the strategy. They refuse to have lawyers on the first day. They sack their lawyers, and they don't want any lawyers. And this puts the state into crisis because by Italian law, by the constitution, you have to have a lawyer. This is an anti-fascist measure in the anti-fascist constitution because it's a reaction to the fascist legal systems. And the state doesn't know what to do. The lawyers don't know what to do. So that's the first problem. Then they start killing people outside the courtroom and threatening people. So they kill a magistrate just before this trial takes place, the first killing, planned killing. And again, no one knows what to do. This has never happened before. And the third thing is they threaten the jury. In Italy, you need a jury. The jury comes from members of the public. No one will serve on the jury. They can't get 10 people in the whole of Turin to serve on the jury. Everyone sends in a sick note, which basically is saying, I'm too ill, I'm too nervous, can't do it. They can't get 10 people. First trial is abandoned after, it doesn't even start in 1976. And they also use the courtroom for propaganda. So one of the things is they admit on the first day, we are the Red Brigades, which is the main charge of the trial. So we're all in the Red Brigades and we take collective responsibility for what we've done. So that's kind of weird. But they also use the courtroom to make speeches, shout, they insult. Famous moment when Franceschini throw his shoe, captured an amazing photo by the court photographer. So they use it as a political platform. And the state doesn't know what to do. So the first one is abandoned. Try again. They try again in 1977, a year later. So a year, the trial doesn't take place. It's even worse in 1977. No jury. They kill a leading lawyer involved. That attempt in 1977 is abandoned after 1 minute of the attempt to do it. The president of the court gets up, reads a tiny declaration saying it's impossible to form a jury, trial's abandoned. So it's even worse. And this is the moment when the Red Brigades feel very powerful indeed. So the state has to change. And by 1978, everything has changed. This setting, and this will become the norm. But one of the impacts of terrorism is this becomes the courtroom in Italy, which is a negative thing, right, for everybody. One of the things with terrorism is that repression, more repressive laws are passed. Lots of democratic aims are got rid of. They managed to form a jury in 1978, finally, thanks to a radical, a very leading member of the Radical Party called Adelaide Aglietta, who is called up to the jury, doesn't know what to do, agrees to serve, and her example helps a few. They also made it that we could 500 people to the jury, whereas before the law was 20. So they're changing, the Red Brigades are changing the rules of Italy, they're changing the laws to adequately prosecute them. And this trial comes to a conclusion. Mitra testifies, it's very dramatic, but they put them behind bars, and that's the end of that historic group. There's still a group outside, but that's kind of the end of that historic group. So I think it's kind of just the trial of the century. There's been very little written about it. It's this amazing combination of murder, intimidation, the state scrambling to deal with their celebrity, but also very questionable moment of re-victimization. Some of the victims of the Red Brigades are actually interrogated by the Red Brigades in the courtroom because the lawyers aren't really there, although they are. And just to take you a little bit behind the scenes, the archive is an extraordinary set of things. It's not just documents, it's also things, because it's the investigation. It's kind of going into a museum. I came across the sunglasses they put on Sossi when they released him in an envelope, and they were women's sunglasses, and they were trying to humiliate him because they put him in a park and said, don't take these minutes, and left him there. He doesn't know where he is when they release him. So there's an amazing material here which has been kind of undervalued, and it's one of the things I'm interested in taking further, is how do you analyze the material stuff, bullet out of envelopes, things like that. Now, in the last part, I'm not really going to talk about this because the whole lecture in itself, okay? The most famous, infamous, world-famous moment of the Red Brigade is the kidnap and murder of Aldo Moro, the Christian Democrat politician, in 1978 in Rome, of which has been written hundreds of books and journalistic articles, no one knows how many. This is kind of the peak in terms of efficiency and political power and politicity. This is world news. If you look at the newspapers, Time, Newsweek, every single paper in the world has this on its front page. Red Brigades become a global organisation, this moment. And particularly the moment of the kidnap becomes something that interrogate themselves over again and again and again. Who was there? What happened? What are the details of that case? Was it just the Red Brigades? Again, if I was a conspiracy theorist, this is kind of Italy's JFK on acid, because there's all kinds of things going on here. And every so often there's a new revelation that emerges, something, oh yes, we've seen a member of the Drang Andra in the background or something like that. There are many, many theories about this, okay? And we could talk about them in the discussion. I'm not going to go into them here. But it's an extraordinary moment, organised by the Rome Collana of the Red Brigades with 4 shooters and, a huge preparation, which works like clockwork. And they kill 5 of the, there's a dead body here, kill 5 of his bodyguards and drivers, kidnap Moro, and again, the world is transfixed by the negotiation. People who want to negotiate, people who don't want to negotiate, it kind of divides Italy. I don't think it changed Italy. I think that's rhetorical, very much. There's always Italy was never the same again. There's quite a lot of rhetoric around that. I don't really think about that, but we could talk more about that, but I'm not going to go in detail. I just want to think about how the Red Brigades were defeated and the end game. And the state does actually adopt quite an intelligent strategy by the end, which is a combination of carrot and stick. The stick is the dark side. It becomes torture, it becomes repression, it becomes very isolated prisons in places like Asinara off the Sardinian coast. So there's a lot of more repression of the Red Brigades. At first they did pretty well. Time goes on, it becomes worse and worse. The carrot is perhaps the more interesting part, which is the use of pentiti. So the law is changed to allow people to provide state's evidence short sentences, very controversial, because, you know, you've got someone like Patrizio Pecci, who was a member of the Turin cell, who killed a lot of people himself, gets like 3 for that, for 4 to 5 murders and various others, because he gives names. He's a full-blown pentito, and he becomes the hated figure for the Red Brigade. He's the first person from within to betray, and he's still alive. He's in the witness protection program, and he turns up in court. The photographers are fascinated by him again and again and again, and gives his version. He's like a computer. He remembers every detail of the events, and that's very important. By 81, they're able to break the organization through violence, state violence, but also through bringing pentiti out of it, like the mafia. This is the blueprint for the mafia of Falcone and Borsellino, the strategy against the mafia later on. So Pecci is very important, and then there will be many other pentiti who follow, and that needs legal change, that needs new laws, and that's what works. I won't go into too much detail, but we can talk about maybe in the discussion. It's the hinterland, which is something I'm interested in the book, and who supports that, but I'm not going to go into that. I just want to talk about the end game. So it really becomes, it's pretty much horrific. It's very, you know, it's a horror story, it's a tragedy, which I'm telling, but it gets worse and worse in many ways. The group starts to turn in on itself as time goes on. They start to kill each other towards the 1980s. There's a kind of paranoia that sets in, and they hold these people's trials in prison and kill parts of their own organization. In part, it's a kind of desperate attempt to survive, but it doesn't work because they're in decline. The movement is in decline. The hinterland has been so you have this story of collapse, internal violence, which happens towards the end of the story, mostly in prison. Most of them in prison by this time. Hardly any have remained in the outside world. And it's, you know, it's pretty horrific. And I think one of the ways to understand a group like the Red Brigades is through the logic of the group. The group is all powerful. It's all about the group. Group identity, very ideological, highly ideological people, driven by ideology and driven by the group staying together. If the group disintegrates, then everything falls apart quite quickly. And we get this very surreal ending placed in a TV studio. And if you're interested to watch this, it's one of the weirdest, most uncomfortable things you could watch. So 1987, 3 of the very important Moretti show, and this is Barbara Balzerani, 3 of the leaders of the Red Brigades. They give an interview to this slightly uncomfortable journalist. They're right very close to each other. And what they say is, they basically say, the war is over, we've lost, we don't want to fight anymore. They don't say they were wrong. There's no self-criticism at all. It's like a statement of fact. They say, it's over. And can we negotiate a way out of this? Can we negotiate an end to being in prison? But there's one of the most interesting things about it, which you can watch, there's no sense of any sense of that what they did was wrong in any way. Everything they did is told in kind of third person dialogue. It's like, we were part of a struggle, we were the most part. They hate the word terrorist, they keep correcting the guy on the terrorism. They basically declare an end to the war, and in 1988 the organization is wound up and doesn't exist anymore. There are a couple of killings by people who call themselves Red Brigades, but they're kind of reinventions. They don't have a continuity with the original group. So just to finish, and there's all kinds of questions we could open up here. One thing which I haven't really dealt with is the conspiracy theories, and there are so many of them, and their power, and they really kind of rule the way this story is told here. If you listen to some of the podcasts about the Red Brigades, they're entirely conspiracy theory run, you know, mostly. I'm not on that line, and it's going to be interesting when the book comes out in Italy how people react to it on that. I think as an historian, you need proof and evidence. Conspiracy theories, by kind of definition, don't have that. But I'm happy to discuss which ones we want to go along with. One of the problems, my problems, is that people just throw every single one out the wall and see which one is going to stick. P2, whatever, all of them. And I think you have to pick one. Maybe you can't have KGB and. I mean, you want to, make your mind up, right? Which one you're going to go for. There's also the transnational aspect, which I don't deal with too much, which is very important. In fact, you've got a collection of terrorist books in your library, and I just picked out one about Montreal, and I didn't know anything about that. And my God, the parallels in 1970 are incredible. They even had their flag was like the Tupamaros and everything. I didn't know anything. So we have lots of places in the world where this is happening, where people are young people are being radicalized, turning to violence, usually ends in disaster and repression. There are radical professors who are kind of energizing them. So there's national dimension. There's the idea of legacy. Only the other day, politicians in Italy were saying the Red Brigades are back with relation to some of the demonstrations about Palestine. It's kind of often brought up as the kind of worst thing that could happen, right? So that, it's still there in the zeitgeist. And what happens to the Brigade City after is also very interesting. I kept being given content for them, and I never really either had the courage or know whether it was worthwhile getting in touch. I have written an email to Mario Moretti, but he hasn't replied to me. But is it worth interviewing them or not is an interesting question. Are they going to say anything new? I doubt it. But one of the interesting things, just to conclude, is there are lots of things we don't know. There are lots of murders that are unresolved. That we haven't had justice, for example. The Red Brigades who are still alive, and a lot of them are dying now. Another one died, 3 have died this year. That's the age they are. They're in their 70s and 80s. They know who did these murders, but they won't say. And they won't say probably because there's going to be a trial. So what we haven't had is a kind of let's have a truth commission, let everybody say their truth, and at least we'll have that, because that's stopping truth come out. So lots of the murders, we may never know who did them, which individuals did them. We know the Red Brigades did them, but which individuals did them, which is important to the victims, families. We may never know, and it's later in the day because they're dying, and there won't be many of them left afterwards. So, yeah, I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. I think we have some time for questions or yes.
Professor Foote, can you tell me how you got here? Maybe got here on an airplane, but how did you get here to Italy with the Red Brigade and other things?
How did I? So I started study because of my professor Paul Ginsburg back in the late 1980s, who I did my PhD with. So it's his fault that I started studying it. So I went to Milan and I sort of stayed there for 20 years. How I just worked on the Red Brigades? Well, they'd always been in my orbit. And I suppose I worked for a long time on Piazza Fontana and the 1960s in other spheres about memory, but they're always there. And it seemed to me that there are lots of books about brigades, but not many by historians. So it was a story that I thought would be interesting to tell. And there's also a vast amount of material. So that was kind of my inspiration for doing it. And it's probably slightly bad tasting to say, but it is actually, the material is extraordinary. It's kind of crazily fun at times because it's so out. There's kind of you're turning the page of the archive saying, what? I can't believe that. So there is this kind of aspect of all the bits that are unresolved, so there's a kind of investigative thing. And it's from my dad, who was a journalist, I don't know, but yeah.
Yes, I wanted to know, it was all very negative, right, their activities, but did anything positive come out of their activities?
That's a tough one.
I mean, that would have to be the initial reason for them to get together, no?
They thought, let's go into their kind of what they thought they were doing. I mean, they thought they were going to either spark a revolution or be part of a revolutionary movement. So that's what their motivation was. And they, you know, I think they really genuinely believed that. I mean, they were generally very ideological people who've been very...
The revolution going towards what, socialism?
Yeah.
Socialism.
Actually more, I would say they were more like Stalinists. Like they were very believe in democracy, liberal democracy, any kind of democracy. I mean, if you look at their language, and I think there's a famous article by Rossano Rossando, who was a communist, who talks about recognizing the language of the Red Brigades as that of the kind of 1950s community. I think that's what they believed in, a kind of dictatorship of the proletariat or something like that. I'm just desperately trying to think of something positive. I suppose the only positive thing is it's a kind of antibody to anyone else doing this. So, you know, it's a cautionary tale. Tragedy. I mean, for me, it's a tragedy. That's what it is.
Tale, we should be telling it today, no?
Yeah, exactly. I think it is still relevant. The idea that there's a shortcut to change, the idea that violence will get you chained, is a tragic idea. And this, you know, and they really believe that, but they also, lots of people around them in the hinterland believe that. Were kind of happy when they shot someone or killed someone, and it's also tragic, I think. And you know, that mindset, I think, is very dangerous. It's very easy for that to happen. I quoted, where is it I quoted? In the hinterland thing. They killed a lot of bastards, okay? Now that is a direct quote from a friend of mine in Milan who lived through that. And it kind of sums up that ambiguity that I think was around. There was people who said, oh, I don't think that's the right tactic, that's not going to work, but they killed a lot of bastards, right? Because there's kind of total hatred at that time. So it's cautionary tale, I think, yeah. Maybe that's the only positive thing about it. But, you know, they were charismatic figures as well. People, Fabrizio De André, for example, you know, famous songwriter, he wrote a song where he kind of praises Goggio halfway through it. I mean, you know, it's interesting, that hinterland, I think.
Just to build on this question of sort of ideology, at times as you're driving sort of the way it's all spun out of control, it makes me think more of a group like the Manson family or a cult than a political entity guided and held together by ideological principles. So to what extent do you think ultimately the glue here with the personal relationships and sort of the getting in too deep and not being able to get out versus some kind of ideological cohesion?
It's a really good question. I think often the initial joining is ideological. So if we look at the life stories of the Brigatisti, they're often involved in the movement. They've seen violence. They might have been beat up at all kinds of pathways. So that initial kind of, it's time to take up arms, is ideological. I think the cult-like aspects come when they're in. And I think that is an interesting way of thinking, the group becoming all-powerful. And once you're in, you can't really get out. So Moretti used to tell the new recruits, he says, in 3 years you'll be dead or in prison, right? It's pretty bleak future. And all you've got, the more they're clandestine, the more they're what they do, all you've got is the other Brigatisti. Your sexual relationships are with, it becomes more and more a closed, and that detachment from reality becomes more and more powerful. So they start killing people and no one can understand who they're killing. At one point they kill a communist trade unionist, and there's, you know, it seems like they've lost all contact with reality. I think they have by then. It's a really interesting, I think that idea of the group is a really psychological, is all to go with understanding them. But I think the initial adherence is often ideological. I mean, almost always. ideological, very, very convinced communists, revolutionary communists, that they want to be in the Red Brigades. Yeah.
Thank you very much for this. I was just when you said that the model kidnapping, you don't think that it changed with the course of Italy. And I was wondering if you were referring to sort of kidnapping at such a high level or model more specifically, especially at that time. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. I think what I mean by that is that there's it's kind of the anti. There's a lot of books and journals saying Italy was never the same again. Everything changed after kidnapping Moro. But actually, politically, in terms of the political system, the historic compromise happened. That government was voted through. It wasn't a great success. And Italy kind of continued as it had before. And so I suppose I'm pushing back on that kind of idea that killing Moro, of course, Moro might have made a difference, but I think there's this, didn't destroy the historic compromise. It didn't destroy the political system. So it kind of reinforced. And Echo wrote a really great piece about what actually the Red Brigades did was reinforce the system. They didn't break the system, they reinforced the system. And it's like Umberto Eco's analysis of the Cultural Revolution in China, which was all this show, but actually what it's about is reinforcing the power of Mao. It's not about revolution or elites or anything like that. Well, that was, if that makes sense, that's really my point, is to kind of see a lot of the rhetorical takes on it. And yeah, that's what I'm trying to get across. I think it changes the Red Brigades because although it seems like they're a great success, actually it's the end for them because they don't know where to go after that.
Ask you a question, if I may. So the Red Brigades, one of the most visible groups, but certainly if they're one group, and also there are groups on both sides of the political spectrum. In working on this book, as a researcher, as a historian, how much do you have to go into all the other groups that were active at the time, and also how I don't know, maybe because it's some of those things that that belongs to my own personal history, but at a moment when I was really conscious of what was going on politically, I was but I always had this sense of, I remember, as of all these groups that were kind of out there and now they haven't been able to make much sense of their connections. So as you write something like a history of the Red Brigades, how much do you engage the other groups, and what are their relationship with the various? You feel like there's like this shadow world.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think you have to kind of block out some of the others because there are so many of them. The book is already quite long, and I think there's partly a marketplace, right? There's this kind of competition between groups to see who can recruit the most. And for a time, the Red Brigades are seriously challenged by Prima Linea. The Prima Linea doesn't have the rules and regulations that will allow it to survive, but they become kind of very media savvy. But lots of groups are formed so that the people in them can join the Red Brigades. So kind of like they think, young people radicalized in the 70s think, if I form a group and kill someone, the Red Brigades will come and recruit me. And that's obviously what happens with Walter Tabaggi, this journalist. So young people in Milan, there's a great book by a French journalist called Ragazzi di Buona Famiglia. So there's this kind of quite middle-class group of young people in Milan. They want to be in the Red Brigades. They form a group of 4 of them. They kill Walter Tabaggi, pretty easy target. He's a journalist on the street. And then they all get arrested and end up in the Red Brigade. So many of these groups last like 2 months, do one thing, burn one hour. But yeah, I mean, if you were to do it properly, you would have to write about all the other groups and also the connections. Sometimes people are moving between the groups as well. So it's quite fluid occasionally. And in trials, they would sometimes be together. So it's a bit artificial. Your point is a good one, to separate them. And then not to mention even the fascist groups, who often...
Curious about, I mean, is there like, what's happening in the background?
Yeah.
I can't
Some of the fascists, particularly a group called NAR, which is Fioravanti, Mambro. So this is a right-wing terrorist group. They really, the Black Red Brigades, if you like, the way they act, what they do. But again, they don't have discipline or the rules and regulations to survive. I mean, 18 years is a very long time for an organization to survive society. Most of these groups just fizzle quite quickly, but they, you know, everybody want the Red Brigades to become the most important, become the most prestigious. It's a weird road to use. If you look in some of these studies, you find these 400 sigle, all the sigle of these groups, and it's incredible how many of them there were, how many guns there were around at that time. Some of them clearly Secret Service inspired as well, or fake. So there is that going on as well. So, you know, yeah, would be to do a complete history would be an amazing thing. And I know that Jack Veglas is working on Ordine Nuovo, so he's not here to talk about that as well, because we already started talking about the differences. And one of the differences is that the right would often use bombs. Red Brigades never used bombs. They used some little bombs at the start, but never against people. So they never used, they would always target specific people and then say, and if they did a mistake, if they killed the wrong person, they would say, we didn't mean to kill that person. I mean, it's a bit mealy-mouthed, to say the least.
I feel better about it.
But they never used bombs, and that kind of marks them out from the IRA or ETA or many of these other groups. They always said, we're going to kill this particular reason, although often it's a kind of symbolic target. It's a policeman, they're a policeman. They don't care who the person is because they've got a uniform. So it's a person, but it's a symbol at the same time. So yeah, there's a lot more to do on the other groups. And actually, when Pecci is arrested, he gives names for Red Brigades, but he also gives names from other groups. Particularly the son of a Christian Democrat politician called Marco Tin, which causes a huge scandal. So he knows some of the others. And that's the world he moves in, and they don't betray each other. And when he betrayed this guy, then that group collapsed as well. So he was able to bring down basically two groups at the same time. Yeah, so it's an amazing story in that way.
How will the Einaudi edition differ from the English one?
Well, it'd be less explanation, but I've got new material all the time coming in, so I'm going to add in some of that stuff from the archives. So I'm adding bits and pieces. I'm finding new stuff all the time, so that's mainly what the difference will be. But also, you know, I don't have to explain who the Christian Democrats are. I hope not. So they're going to take out some.
It's been a while.
Yeah, you know, I mean, maybe I do, but yeah, I think a little bit of editing here and there. It won't be that. Also, unfortunately, the English edition's got a lot of authors that I found, which I'm very proud of, but the Einaudi won't use them because it's an interesting thing. The laws are very different. If you notice in some books now, history books, that they have to blur the face, and it's not much point putting the photo in if they're blurring the face. So the privacy laws are quite invasive in Italy. Whereas I'm very proud of my photos that I found, because lots of them haven't been published before, including that one on the front. People think that's me, but it's not. That's a real person from the 1970s. I haven't got a gun, I just want to say. I did get slightly obsessed with guns, and I was worried that I was going to be on some watch list for, because at one point I got obsessed with this gun called the Scorpion, which was a terrorist gun based in Czechoslovakia, which is very good for terrorists, a very light gun. And I was going to get some money to go and visit the gun factory in Czechoslovakia. Then I sort of thought about this. I think I'm going a bit too far. I better stop. This is getting a bit ridiculous now. My business needs to be stopped.
Any other questions or comments?
Yeah, I was just curious if you could talk a little bit
I don't think it was a complete perversion. I think there were parts of the resistance that, you know, felt betrayed, for sure, kept their guns, and there were fringes who continued to kill after the war in Milan and other places, Reggio Emilia. There were still quite a lot of guns around. And when the 60s explodes, some of these guys are tempted by the idea of torniamo in montagna, you know. So it's not a complete perversion. There are parts of that, of the partisans, the resistance, that you can draw on that. I think to then claim that you're the heirs of the resistance is, of course, ridiculous, right? But, you know, there are a number of ex-partisans who get involved with the Red Brigades. Famously, one of the guns in the photo is a partisan gun. So that, I think it's the fringe part. And yes, particularly in those places where that memory, Franceschini, one of the first Red Brigades, his granddad and his dad were in the resistance. His dad had been in Auschwitz. He had this family history which kind of led him to see himself as the heir of this tradition. And so I think, yeah, that's the way I would interpret it. They say with the new partisans and things like that, they really need to see Italy as a non-democratic state to make that stick. So they paint the court as they call it a special tribunal stuff. But